Mercy, 2nd Legislative District, Erie County.
Good morning.
There you go.
Good morning, everyone. Representative Danilo Burgos of the 197th Legislative District, which is Philadelphia.
Good morning, everyone. Jeannie McNeil. I'm from Lehigh County, which is about an hour outside of Philadelphia. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Gina Curry, and I proudly serve the 164th District, which is in Delaware County.
Good morning. I am glad to be in the 3rd District today. No, the 2nd District. I am Joanna McClinton. I serve my neighbors in both Philadelphia and Delaware County. And for this term, I'm the leader for the Pennsylvania House Democratic Caucus.
Good morning, everyone. I am Representative Donna Bullock. I represent the 195th District, which includes parts of North Philadelphia. And I serve as the chair of the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus.
Morning, everyone. My name is Tina Davis. I'm the Democratic Caucus Secretary. I'm from Bucks County. Glad to be here.
Good morning. My name is Pam Snyder. I represent the 50th District, which encompasses all of Greene County, a portion of Fayette County, and a portion of Washington County in the very southwest corner.
Good morning, everybody. Representative Jessica Benham from the 36th District in Allegheny County.
Good morning. I'm Representative Chris Sinot. I represent the 9th District, which is in Lawrence County.
Good morning. My name is Dan Williams. I represent the 74th District in Chester County, Pennsylvania. It's good to be with you.
Good morning. My name is Emily Kincaid. I represent the 20th District, which is also in Allegheny County.
Thank you, members. Representative Bullock, I'm going to hand the hearing over to you. Thank you. Thank you, Julia. Here in Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Chair Pizarro, for inviting many of us to Erie again and being such a great host. As chair of the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus, it is truly an honor to partner with the Policy Committee to bring issues that are important to Black Pennsylvanians to every corner of the Commonwealth. The Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus was formed in the General Assembly in the 1970s. In fact, next year we will be celebrating our 50th anniversary as a caucus. The members stand at about 30 members strong, representing communities of color from across the Commonwealth, and we are excited to hopefully welcome additional members after the November election, members that are far and that reach far and wide across the Commonwealth, not just in Philadelphia, but also in other communities such as Harrisburg and Reading, and throughout the Commonwealth as well. We understand that the issues that impact communities of color aren't just in Philadelphia, aren't just in Pittsburgh. They are throughout every single corner, including here in Erie. We would like to thank our good friend and the current secretary of our foundation board, Selena King, for inviting us today and helping us coordinate today's hearing. In addition to my membership as the chair of the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus, I also have the opportunity of serving and representing the Democratic Caucus on the School Safety and Security Committee with the governor, through the governor's office at the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. And one of the tasks of that particular committee is to disperse funds that were allocated through our budget process to address safety in our schools, gun violence in our schools, and gun violence in our communities. This year, through our budget process, through the leadership of our great leader, Joanna McClinton, and our leaders in the Senate, we've been able to secure $120 million for community violence grants that we hope communities like Erie will take advantage of and seek assistance so that you can address violence on the ground in your communities. Today we'll hear from representatives and neighbors and leaders here in Erie about how violence is impacting your community. And we would like to thank you again for taking this time for joining us. And we look forward to hearing from the community in Erie about how violence impacts your community directly. That being said, we will start with our first panel. Our host for today, our facility host, thank you again for welcoming us into your house. And that is our Bishop Dwayne Brock. Thank you. You may start.
Mr. Chairman and distinguished and honorable legislators, local elected officials, exceptional clergy, and all those in the order of their protocol responsibilities. Welcome to the city on the lake, the city that we call home, Erie, Pennsylvania. Welcome to our campus. I am Bishop Dwayne Brock, and of course, welcome to Bishop Brock Way. I'm Dwayne Brock, founding Episcopate of the Eagles Nest Leadership Corporation. I'm the board chair of the Erie Housing Authority. I sit on the boards of the Hammett Health Foundation, UPMC Hospital, and one of the trustees of Erie Bank. As the longest serving clergyman in the city of Erie, 43 years, I have come to the distinctive conclusion that our methodology of ministry must change. Not the message, but the method. Our ministries from the pulpit to the pew must become more relevant, resourceful, and restorative. Gun violence where we live has become epidemic, especially amongst our youth. One young man was shot a year ago right here on this campus. Young black boys becoming statistical pawns in a lopsided judicial system has become a new normal. And yes, it is even epidemic. And unnecessary funeral services among young black boys has become too regular. As sermonic oracles, our messages must become less bombastic and more relevant, less pie in the sky and more down to earth, relevant, and less entertaining and more magnetic towards black men. Black men is the key. Black men is the missing ingredient. Black men is the catalyst to effect transformational change within our communities. Once again, black men empowered by this gospel will captivate and motivate and stimulate their black sons, which in turn and simultaneously will resuscitate black families. And once you touch black families will change the community for the better. Mr. Chairman, I laud and I recognize and I recommend the extraordinary ministry of a local Reverend Darrell Craig, more affectionately known as Brother D within our community. His pulpit has become the streets, whose techniques through his 501c3 organization, the Blue Coats, is absolutely legendary and can be duplicated in other cities within our blessed Commonwealth. Lastly, to our honorable legislators, the Bible, our foundation, clearly tells us to never forget the old landmarks. And to us, that emphatically says the message to what we call the black church. Historically, it was always the black church. It will always be the black church. Politics for black communities began in the black church. Education started within the black church. Socialization, it began there within the confines of the black church. And all fraternal organizations, fraternities and sororities, it began right there within the black church. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask you and I implore you and I beseech you to direct us, talk to us, show us, and tell us how to consolidate, if necessary, our 501c3s to come together to place functional, plausible, doable programming within our communities. And I guarantee you that once that happens, once we get the necessary funding within the confines of the Black church, we will see a definite transformative change for the better right here within Erie, Pennsylvania. Once again, I thank you for your time. I thank you for your allotment. I am Bishop Dwayne.
Thank you, Bishop, for your remarks. And I echo your sentiment. The role of the Black church in our communities has always been there to provide the resources, services that many of our families rely on. You mentioned funding, and I wanted to point out that the School Safety and Security Committee will be releasing its funding proposals, RFPs, later this month, if not early September. So I would encourage you to follow the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime Delinquency's website to find when that grant opportunity becomes available to apply for it. But looking at the role of the Black church and the community organizations that are housed often in the church, what programs do you think would be, what kind of programs should we be considering funding that you found to be successful here in Erie? You mentioned the Blue Coats. Can you share a little bit more about that and other programs that you currently operate out of this facility?
Well, number one, the Blue Coats is a 501c3 organization headed and founded by Darryl Craig, and they have linked up with the Erie School District. In fact, what they do, they travel around to the various schools, and they are there when the young people go to school, and they are there when young people get out of school, and they minimize violence. They minimize fights and disturbances and different antagonisms amongst the young people, funded by the Erie School District, but it has been a very, very interesting and plausible organization right here within Erie, Pennsylvania. What we do here at Eagles Nest, I am the leader of the Eagles Nest Leadership Corporation. Not the only organization, there are other organizations within Erie that's doing a Herculean job and task here. But what we do, we take young people and young adults. To date, we have over 225 young adults and young people working full-time at UPMC Hospital. We recognize that we teach them about the soft skills, about how to go to work, how to be on time, how to have a plan A, how to have a plan B, how to be professional. We teach them about financial literacy, what to do, how money works, how to make investments. We teach them about the dynamics of insurance. But we teach them on a younger scale. We teach young ladies how to be young ladies. We teach young men how to be young men. Because unfortunately, in many cases, they are not getting those dynamics at home. Our young people today, not just in Erie, but all over the Commonwealth and all over the United States of America, in many cases we have to rely on social media to teach our kids. I am a big advocate of responsible parents, and I recognize that parents are the first teachers that our kids see. And then on that same vein that I'm an advocate, we have a school here, the Eagles Nest School of Academic Distinction, where we teach young people character. We teach them about America. We teach them about the dynamics of the African American experience, about Black history, the contributions of African Americans towards the welfare of our great country. And they have to do certain things. In our school, there's a yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am dynamic. They have to say the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning, and they have to recite a creed. And amongst all of that, they have to wear a shirt and tie and dress shoes to school. They may not like that, But that's one thing that we stress the importance of. And as I tell the young people, you know a police officer by their uniform. You know a doctor by their uniform. You know a nurse by their uniform. And so we got to make them wear uniforms to class.
Thank you, Bishop. Just wanted to check with any of my colleagues. Are there any questions on this side? Thank you, Bishop Rock.
Thank you very kindly once again.
Thank you. We have been joined by our whip, Jordan Harris, and Representative Napoleon Nelson. And now we'll be joined by Reverend Lamont Higginbotham, the VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Erie Community College. Is he? Okay. We'll then move on, if you don't mind, to Josh Flightman, the Western PA Manager for Ceasefire PA.
Good morning. My name is Josh Fleetman. I am the Western Pennsylvania Manager for Ceasefire PA Education Fund, the Commonwealth's gun violence prevention organization. It's an honor to be here with you all to share some suggestions on how you as policymakers can help prevent youth violence. My recommendations fit broadly into two main categories. First, policies to make it harder for guns to get in the hands of people who intend to cause harm, including youth, most notably by addressing the sources of illegal firearms in our communities. And second, investments to address the root causes of gun violence. On the first topic of illegal firearms, it's important to understand that yes, firearms that are already illegally possessed under state law are fueling much of the youth violence. But most guns in circulation were purchased legally and then through a particular process became possessed illegally. One major mechanism here is weapons that are lost or stolen by irresponsible gun owners, or weapons that are claimed to be lost or stolen by gun traffickers and straw purchasers. Currently in Pennsylvania, there is no requirement for firearm owners to report to law enforcement when their weapon goes missing, which happens on average 21 times each day in Pennsylvania alone. There is a simple solution: legislation requiring the reporting of lost and stolen firearms within 72 hours of noticing it's missing. In this session, House Bill 980 and Senate Bill 217 will encourage responsible gun owning behavior, help hold irresponsible gun owners and straw purchasers accountable, and will provide more data and information to law enforcement, helping them to identify patterns of illegal gun trafficking and interrupt illegal gun trafficking networks. One study showed that these laws reduce the movement of illegal guns by 46%. I urge each of you to co-sponsor this legislation and put pressure on leadership to allow a vote. We've heard strong support from both sides of the aisle for reducing the flow of illegal guns. This is a place where I really do believe bipartisan consensus already exists, and we can see tangible policy progress that will make Pennsylvania safer. The second major mechanism by which legal guns become illegal is a small number of rogue gun dealers flouting the law or neglecting their due diligence, resulting in their weapons being used in crime. A recent report by Brady, a national gun violence prevention organization, found that a small number of gun stores are responsible for the vast majority of crime guns in Pennsylvania. The U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or ATF, is the sole federal agency responsible for inspecting gun dealers to ensure compliance with the legal requirements that are designed to address gun trafficking. I encourage you to send correspondence to the newly Senate-approved ATF Director, Steve Dettelbach, urging him to prioritize inspection of gun dealers in Pennsylvania and to not hesitate to use ATF's authority to revoke the licenses of rogue gun dealers. Briefly, I also encourage you to support other policies that would make it harder for guns to get into the hands of people who want to cause harm, including raising the age to purchase long guns from 18 to 21, closing the gap in existing law, and requiring background checks for the private sale of long guns, which we're seeing used more in youth violence. requiring the secure storage of firearms in the home to help keep parents' guns away from kids. And finally, removing the firearm preemption provisions from the state law to empower local governments to enact these same policies if the General Assembly is unwilling or unable to do so. The second category of my policy recommendations centers around investments in programs that prevent gun violence by addressing its social, emotional, and economic root causes. As the Honorary Representative Bullock mentioned, I applaud the General Assembly for allocating a record level of funding in the FY23 budget for gun violence prevention and intervention distributed by PCCD as competitive grants to community-based and nonprofit organizations, municipalities, counties, district attorney's offices, and institutions of higher education. This type of funding is vital, and this investment is vital in preventing youth violence. My primary policy concern for the future fiscal year budgets is the sustained availability of this funding. We must maintain at least $100 million funding in annual appropriations for this violence prevention and intervention over the next few years to allow stability for these programs. As I conclude, I want to share some new numbers that could add further insight and urgency to address this crisis of youth violence. Ceasefire PA recently polled 400 at-risk youth in Allegheny County, where I live. The results, while perhaps not surprising given recent events, were nonetheless shocking. Among the survey's most recent findings, most concerning findings, 57% have lost a family member to gun violence. Almost half, 46%, have personally witnessed gun violence at least once. Of that group, 22% have witnessed gun violence 4 or more times. 86% are concerned that gun violence will impact them and their families' health and safety. And 84% feel that nothing at all or only a little is being done to address the violence in their neighborhood, school, or classroom. These numbers indicate that we are witnessing the mass traumatization of a generation. The policies I've discussed today will help address this. And that's the key final point I'd like to make in closing. Gun violence is a solvable problem, and its continued escalation is in many ways a policy failure and a political choice. Despite talking points that you may hear from pro-gun organizations, study after study does show that states with stronger gun laws have less gun violence. I urge you all to do whatever it takes to enact these life-saving policies and others your constituents and all Pennsylvanians are counting on. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. A lot of what you pointed out really resonated with me as a mother of 2 sons in Philadelphia. And many of us have visited schools, talked to young people, and it is so common for them to have had someone impacted by violence directly in their community, in their families. Many of our young people in Philadelphia are used to hearing gunshots right outside their classroom. I was on a call with a principal who told me, you know, there were gunshots right at 3 o'clock at dismissal, and she had to hold the students, and the students said, we're used to it. Don't hold us. We're ready to go home. It's just so common for them to hear gunshots ringing through their community that they're not even disturbed. And so that community trauma is something we definitely need to take a look at and how it impacts all of our young people as we move forward. And Ceasefire does a lot of work across the Commonwealth to address community violence in our communities and neighborhoods, and have been strong advocates of legislation, much of which you mentioned in your testimony and in your written testimony. My question for you is, of all of the programs that you've seen, where should we be focusing our dollars at this moment? Is it intervention? Is it prevention? You know, there's the long-term programs like prevention, the mentoring and those things. Those are not going to have immediate impact on the violence that we are seeing today. And then there's the street units, programs like the Blue Coats or other programs that are doing that direct intervention with those who are engaged or are at risk or likely targets, likely shooters. Where do you see our work or our investment having the most impact?
Thank you. I think specifically with youth violence, a lot of the programs and the types of programs we talked about are really important. Specifically, school-based trauma-informed programs, I think, are a growing area that need more investment. I think we've seen here in Erie and in Philadelphia, and across the state, that trauma from past gun violence is fueling future gun violence. And the retaliatory shootings and the pain that our young people are feeling, and they don't necessarily have the skills and the knowledge and the experience to deal with that trauma and those emotions. So having counselors embedded in schools or in youth-serving community organizations that provide that trauma-informed care, there's that saying that hurt people hurt people. So if you can unhurt somebody, that's a good word, but if you can help address that hurt, that will help prevent future violence from taking place. And then I do think the street outreach and violence interrupter side is also really critically important. Maybe a little bit less so with the youth. I think it's increasingly important with the youth, but especially with the adult gun violence, we're seeing preventing those retaliations, mediating and de-escalating those disputes before they become gun violence, and after a shooting takes place, again, preventing that retaliation is really key. So by and large, I think PCCD does a pretty good job of weighing these considerations, of making these competitive grant allocations. My biggest concern is just the stability of the funding, as I mentioned. I think it's important, as grantees will probably tell you, if you get a grant one year and then don't get a grant the next year, you have to lay off all your outreach workers, your trauma-informed care specialists. It's really hard to have a lasting impact if you're working on that kind of year-by-year funding basis. So, by our assessment, if we can maintain that $100 million a year for the next 3 to 5 years, we believe we can see a roughly 30% decrease in gun violence across the state based on our analysis from other states' programs.
Thank you. That's much better. We have a question from Representative Gina Curry.
Thank you very much. Based off of what you just said, it went into a segue that I want to just ask you a question about really quickly. So I'm right outside of West Philadelphia in Delaware County, and I live in Upper Darby. And I represent Lansdowne East, Lansdowne, a part of Yeadon, and Millbourne, and it's an area where it's dense in population, and we typically don't have the tragedy that we've seen in our neighboring West Philadelphia and all of Philadelphia. But when it does happen, and it did hit us on July 1st, where a 14-year-old was killed in a basement. And so when you talk about the school-based trauma-informed programs, we have that in Upper Darby. But what I'm finding is the community leaders and the folks who were heavily impacted, now that school's about to start, people are running around and they're not sure what to do because this case is active. And the child who has been charged is going to go back to that school district. So there's laws that need to be put in place around that I'm seeing. But what I'm most concerned about is the programming. Because when you have a community that isn't, quote unquote, used to that type of violence, and people see that it's coming into their community, they tend to be running around like, what do we do for these children? And what we found between July 1st and today, that it's been very difficult to have these types of resources because we don't have them. We've been bringing small focus groups together and community to say, what can we do for the children? So it's making the capable adults look like we don't know what we're doing because we don't have the necessary resource to do it. So my question is, with Ceasefire, when you're seeing these programs, is there anything for the preventative? Like, we are clearly coming on the back end now saying we don't want this to happen again. We know that Instagram is showing us something different with retaliatory comments and things that are being said, but is there something where we can, in a place in Delaware County that the numbers aren't that high, something that we can do so that we, as the capable adults, aren't looking around like this is going to happen again to us in a couple of days, maybe when school starts? I love the program of the blue coats. We've been talking a lot about that, but it takes a long time, I'm finding. It's nothing immediate. Do you have any suggestions on the things that you've seen across the Commonwealth that may help?
I share your frustration. There is no silver bullet or immediate solution. These are so I think a lot of the programs we talked about, I would argue are preventative, but they do take time, as you noted, to take effect. And not to be repetitive here, but I do think a sustained availability of funding, if providers can see clearly, okay, that the state has made a commitment here, there's going to be funding available for the long term, I think that would foster an environment where more of these professionals can commit to this kind of pure choice, and these programs can start to grow and solidify themselves. Unfortunately, it does take time, and I think the programs that we've talked about can prevent violence. One of the challenges is, by its very nature, a prevention program, you're stopping something from happening. So how do you prove 100% that you stop the shooting from taking place? It can be challenging to do that, and I think it's a good case to be made that were it not for the programs currently in place, we would see even more violence taking place. So I would just urge you all to really, starting now with the next year's budget cycle, really emphasizing sustaining this $100 million at least of funding, so that these programs can continue to build the framework and the infrastructure they need to do this work over the long term.
Thank you. We have two more questions. We'll have first Representative Benham, followed by Representative Nelson.
Thank you. Josh, I appreciate your testimony. It's always good to see you. As you are familiar, in Allegheny County, we see significant youth gun violence in entertainment and bar districts. And I'm wondering if you would be able to talk a little bit about that intersection of what happens there. And as sort of a side note to that, Pennsylvania has a unique set of liquor laws compared to other states. And I'm wondering if there's been any data or research about that overlap. If other states see a difference because they have different or more strict or less strict liquor laws than we do.
On the second one, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to be honest with you. I can do some research and try and get back to you. It's an interesting question. I've not explored personally. But I do think, for example, Carson Street is Pittsburgh, and I think a lot of communities across the state have similar, like you said, nightlife and commercial corridors. I do think coming back to that, the flow of illegal guns is really what's key. And by their nature, if you're under age 21, we're not legally allowed to possess a handgun in Pennsylvania. Under age 18, it's a long gun, so these guns are, in many ways, by their nature, illegal. And so I think emphasizing the legislative and the enforcement priorities to try to get ahead of those illegal guns is the best way to do it. And I'm speaking purely from a policy standpoint here. I think Bishop Brock and other testifiers here will share the community element of it. And it's a little bit trite to say, but it does take a village to raise young people who are socialized in a way that they don't feel the need to be violent or to reach for tools of violence. And so while I certainly think the policy side is important, the community side is just as important as well. I wish I had a more fulsome answer to your question. It's a very good one.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. And certainly hearing about the Blue Coats reminded me a lot of the South Pittsburgh Peacemakers.
Yes.
So I'm sure you saw the similarity there too. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you. I appreciate that. This does work well. One of the areas that seemed slightly underspoken to, if not left out from your comments, is the notion of red flag laws, the notion of a community that is there to support individuals that we know are dealing with and going through trauma. Could you speak a little bit more about where this stands, and I'll call it the priorities of both ceasefire and communities that are really wrestling with gun violence prevention, how in the world we can try and get ahead of individuals in our communities who are reaching crisis point?
Thank you, Representative. Yeah, it's a great question. I was time limited, so I didn't include it, but it is one of our top priorities, actually. We have ceasefire, what we call our common agenda. It's a three-pronged legislative platform with extremist protection orders and red flag laws, lost and stolen gun reporting, and universal background checks. So it is a top priority of ours. And in many ways, it enjoys bipartisan support. One of your colleagues on the other side of the aisle is leading that bill in the State House. For those of you who aren't familiar, red flag law, extreme protection order, it's a simple process used in 19 states and DC, where if somebody is showing signs that they are imminent risk to themselves or other people, either a family member or law enforcement, primarily those are the two groups of people, could petition a judge to temporarily remove that person's access to firearms. The current legislation in Pennsylvania and most states is about a 1-year time frame where they would be prevented from purchasing new guns, and apparently the guns that are currently in their possession will be turned over to law enforcement for that 1-year time period. It's a really, really important part of the process. With youth violence in schools, I think that's a critical part. Part of the reason I left it out was because I wanted to focus on youth violence, and if you're under 18, you're not legally allowed to have a gun in the first place. So red flag laws are more appropriate for 18 and over. But we know that 18 to 21 age group is very high risk of gun violence, and even beyond that to age 30. And so, if somebody is showing signs that we see on social media, especially interpersonal disputes between individuals and groups that start off online, there's some kind of beef or disrespect, that could be evidence, that could be something to a judge as, look, they're saying right here they're going to get their crew and you're going to get some revenge because of this perceived slight. And so having that ability to temporarily restrict someone's access to a gun is really key. But it also has to be paired with the policies to address illegal guns, because the red flag process is a legal process, but there's that whole category of illegal guns. So it's a very important priority. We'd love to work with you all on looking for ways to make that get passed into law, because it's really important. And again, there is a lot of bipartisan support among your colleagues, among the general public, even among gun owners. They recognize not just to stop interpersonal violence, but to stop firearm suicide, which is a major driver of gun violence.
So, and now, just speaking for myself, one, I agree completely that it's crucial. I will say that it is the one area that there is a stronger opportunity for real bipartisan support and investment. We've seen investments even in Washington that we have yet to implement here in Pennsylvania. It is an area that I would love and would even push you guys in ceasefire to really prioritize more, because there are an awful lot of conversations that we have around illegal gun trafficking and the ability to bear arms, unfortunately, which is way too easy, and it has been a political fight that we've been having for decades that hasn't really moved, and I suspect it's going to be very difficult in this legislature to continue to move that. There is urgency, and the rest of my comments and questions for you will really revolve around red flag laws themselves, even if we establish and create and pass a bill to actually build the sort of community support that has members, even members of clergy, members in school communities, to actually identify and call out an individual who is nearing that tipping point is not at all small. That is not an insignificant investment in cultural change and a dynamic within a community to say that my neighbor, my family member, my son, my mother, father, whomever is having a real crisis right now, and they are a harm to themselves and others. That is not insignificant. It's not a simple piece of legislation that one colleague can author. So I would ask that you all partner with us and with clergy and with community members far more to actually elevate not just the red flag law, but then the standing up of the community supports and the sort of cultural awareness that needs to partner with that. So have you seen examples of states that are doing that very, very well? And what does that look like in a community like Erie? What would a real, and this may be relatively impossible to answer having not heard the question before, what would a community like Erie that is ready and able to implement red flag mentality have to look like?
Thank you, sir. And to the question of resources, it's a great point. So, we need to pass the law first, but a law is only as good as it is implemented and utilized. And we've seen really tragic situations such as the Buffalo shooting in New York. But New York State has a red flag law, but it was not used, and steps have since been taken to increase its utilization. Other states like California, for example, have launched publicly funded PR campaigns to educate the public on this is a tool that can be used. The federal Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, as you alluded to, has $750 million that's available to states now to help implement red flag laws, primarily by educating and training court systems, law enforcement agencies, that this is a tool that's available. And we've seen states, for example, Illinois, after the July 4th Highland Park shooting, another state that has a red flag law, very rarely used. Since then, there's been a public media blitz from the governor, from state officials, on down to law enforcement, local law enforcement. To make sure people know this is a tool that's available, here's how it works. It's a pretty transparent, simple process. So I think certainly we have to pass the law first, but we do want to make investments in educating the public, in taking advantage of that federal money on the table to train the people who will be involved in actually enacting the red flag. So it's an excellent point that simply passing the law is not enough. We have to make people aware of the process.
Thank you. And now finish grandstanding before I pass the mic, which is, don't forget the shooter in Detroit. They knew ahead of time. They had conversations around that individual's mental health and didn't go all the way, right? So it's really for the community. The red flag laws is the final step in saying we have somebody who is in crisis, and what do we do? So we can continue to build that, and I know, in fact, they're working on a Handle with Care program in the county. There are other areas that we can continue to invest in that don't yet require a law to do the final step in saying, yes, we're going to take that gun, because we still then can envelop that person going through crisis with the rest of the supports that they need. So thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Nelson. Our next question comes from Representative Kincaid.
Thank you. Actually, I think that's a perfect segue. You talked a little bit about enforcement, and I think one of the things that we consistently hear across the aisle is, well, we just need to enforce the laws that are on the books. I think that red flag, ERPO legislation is sort of the perfect example of, the difference in sort of what's on the books in Pennsylvania and what could be. I had a whole debate with our judiciary chairman about 302, which is involuntary commitment for anybody who's not aware. It's incredibly difficult to involuntarily commit someone for mental illness. There's a lot of barriers to that. And if someone is involuntarily committed, they lose basically forever their ability to ever own a firearm. The difference with ERPO is that it's temporary and it has an automatic sort of turn off unless you can demonstrate that someone continues to be a danger to themselves or others. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about the stuff that you have proposed that we need to pass, as well as the laws that are on the books. Why are the laws that are currently on the books, why is enforcing just what we have already not sufficient?
I'll speak to the enforcement part first. So I mentioned the ETF, the federal agency responsible for enforcing gun laws. In many ways, it's an intentional strategy to deprive that agency of the resources, the authority, the credibility needed to conduct these inspections, for example, of gun dealers who, it's pretty broadly known, which gun dealers are flat on the law and are pumping guns in the community, not doing the proper paperwork to account for that. And so we are very heartened to see that the U.S. Senate confirmed an NEPA for the first time since 2013, and that will be key to helping enforce those laws on the books. To your question of why it's not enough to simply enforce the laws on the books, there is a bevy of studies out there that shows that the states with stronger gun laws have less gun violence. So that goes to show that simply, when people say, if somebody wants to get a gun, they're going to get a gun no matter what. If they want to commit a crime, they're going to do so. It's just not true, actually. We can compare state by state. The states that have more sensible restrictions on who can access a gun, people who, in many ways, we already agree are not responsibly situated to own a gun, ways that help provide that accountability. We can show state by state how that works. On the flip side, we can show that weakening state gun laws exacerbates gun violence. A great example is, as you probably know this, I saw you introduce a bill today on permanent purchase yesterday. Missouri used to have a permanent purchase law. This is a law that would say if you want to buy a gun, any gun, you have to get a permit, not just a period. You probably have to actually purchase the gun. Connecticut did not have that kind of law. So Missouri, they took their law off the books, and Connecticut put their law on the books. And we saw gun violence go quite up in Missouri and gun violence go down in Connecticut. So that's just one example that goes to show the efficacy of gun laws. And, you know, it sounds, I often find it frustrating when I hear from some of your colleagues who are lawmakers themselves who make the argument that what's the point in passing laws, we're not going to do anything. I mean, you're lawmakers, and we know they can do something. And so, yes, doing a better job of resourcing the agencies responsible for enforcing the current laws, but really filling the gaps and passing stronger laws. Study after study shows that will help reduce gun violence. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe that concludes our questions for you, Mr. Flightman.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. We'll now be joined by Michael Outlaw, the Community Liaison for the City of Erie. You may proceed.
So, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to speak about, I heard the question I asked, what could we do right now? And so before I go into my information, I want to just make a couple points. Trauma that isn't transformed is transferred. Say it again. Trauma that isn't transformed is transferred. So what we're witnessing play out in our communities across America is an unhealthy dynamic that exists in the home fronts, and it spills over to our streets. Another term I want to put out there is genocide. We're not saying that, but that's what's happening across America. It's genocide. These black boys and black men dying every minute, or how many times a day in America. It's happening on our watch. And so too much is given, much is required. So we have to respond to lawful lives. And in the words of my dear friend, Mr. Gary Horton, who's the local president of the NAACP, is all kids ain't bad. And so though we're addressing violence, youth violence, we cannot forget about the kids in our community who are law-abiding kids and who are doing the positive things to impact the communities. So the program I'm going to speak about is called Unified Erie. Unified Erie was formed in 2010, thanks to our local representative, Mr. Pizarro, Mr. Mercy, for supporting Unified Erie. Unified Erie has a three-pronged approach. Two of them you all have identified: intervention and prevention. Our third prong is reentry. Unified Erie, there's a community action plan that you all can pull up and see exactly that the model of prevention stems from the communities that care model, right? And so this is a data-driven best practice approach to addressing violence. Honorable Nelson, I love the fact that you mentioned red flags, because a part of Unified Erie's program, under the prevention prong, we have this program called the Call-In, right? And the Call-In identifies individuals in our community who are known perpetrators of violence, gun violence, or gang association. And so based on incidents that these individuals have partaken or participated in, we call these individuals into a safe setting. And we give them the message of hope. The mayor speaks, Mayor Schimmer speaks, the district attorney speaks, federal prosecutors, community members, victims of crime speaks, individuals like myself, we all speak about our trajectory to these young men and what it takes for them to become a law-abiding citizen and get off the pathway of destruction. So I personally believe that though grants definitely have value, there, from my opinion, there should be a line item in the state's budget that is geared towards programs that are addressing the violence and gang violence in communities across America. So again, you all can pull up Unified Erie. There's a website out there. It kind of gives more in depth about exactly what's occurring in the program, and what all the risks and the factors exist. So I don't have a lot more to say in regards to Unified Erie and what's needed, but I do know we have a program that's been effective. We've seen years where the gangs who were once identified stopped self-identifying in Erie, Pennsylvania. We've seen a reduction in gun violence in Erie, Pennsylvania. Recently there's been an uptick in youth violence. So our last call-in was last week when we called in the youth in our community whose communities has violence. And the average age was 16. Right? The average age was 16. And so from the city and our community partners, we're doing what we know is best, again, from a data-driven best practice approach to address the violence in our community. And so any funding, that you all can send our way, per se, would be beneficial to us addressing violence in our community.
Thank you, Mr. Outlaw. I appreciate you stepping in this morning and sharing information about Unified Erie. Your programs sound like they're right on target, doing the kind of work that needs to happen on the streets and in our communities to address youth violence and community violence. When you reference the call-in, it reminds me of some programs that I know operate in Philadelphia, like Mothers in Charge, which brings mothers who've lost sons and daughters to gun violence to speak to other perpetrators of violence, to share that, their pain and their suffering, and to work together as with both victims and perpetrators to address that healing that needs to happen so that they can move forward. We often refer to them as credible messengers. Can you tell me how many youth you serve in a year? Do you have those kind of statistics?
I don't know those numbers, because our focus just shifted, honestly, to the youth because of the upticks. Our focus was previously on the adults in our community, so I really don't have those numbers.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, I'll definitely encourage you to follow the PCCD website as well, as the House and Senate had passed that budget, including that grant for community violence programs, and I strongly encourage you to take a look at it and talk to your state reps about how to apply for that funding. And so we'll move forward with questions from Representative Davis, followed by Representative Mirsky.
Thank you. So this is really interesting. My district is right on the border of New Jersey, which is Trenton, Philly, right above Philly, easy access to a lot of different people. I love it because you can get anywhere, but everybody can come in too. So the other day I was going to a business, I like to just stop in, and there was this big giant gym called Jungle Land. And it was a black man and woman trying to, had a big basketball court. And the first question was, do you know us? And I said, no. I said, that's my fault, I guess, because I usually know everybody. And they're like, no, we don't know what we're doing. We have this great big gym. We want to offer it to kids. It's like awesome. So my question, and I agree, they don't know what they're doing. So as a legislator, going back to Bishop's statement that how do we get all these 501c3s to have the same type of vision when there's so many other issues, like we have instability of housing in my district, food crisis in my district. So I can't seem to get like the county and everybody else on the same path, and I don't know how to do it.
What
Thank
I
you.
would, what I would suggest here locally is, so the EDC just released the Erie Inclusive Playbook, right, which I think is like $1.4 billion, funds, through buildings, programs, etc. Right. So in having a conversation, I referenced Gary Horton, in having a conversation with the local NAACP president, Mr. Gary Horton, these are the mindsets that, similar to how EDBC have this Erie Inclusive Playbook, that the communities across Erie, Pennsylvania, who sits or who resides in communities where there's an uptick in violence, there should be some type of inclusive, community-wide playbook that has a holistic lens on how to address the violence. Right? We have churches throughout the city of Pennsylvania. Erie is poised. We have the right leadership in position. We have the relationships in place where people can make policy changes, et cetera, but we are the mindset that there should be some sort of potential consultant that's on board, that looks at Erie's landscape, communities, and have a holistic approach, community-wide program that addresses the issue that's impacting our community. And by doing so, you ensure that there's a racial equity lens that's addressing the issues within our community. So that would be my recommendation.
So do I start that, or do I get the county to start it with me, or all the leaders?
Well, thank your constituents. I was like, without the policies being implemented, I think oftentimes things are at a standstill. But it doesn't prevent us here locally from gathering the troops and beginning to generate our own ideas and plans of what we believe. We know our community better than anyone knows our community, so it would behoove us to begin to draft our own plans, at least initial concept of the plans, and then bring in a professional to say, okay, this makes sense. But again, because the Erie Inclusive Playbook, they onboard a consultant that look at a high level to make sure that those projects yield fruits long term.
Michael, thank you for your testimony today. Thank you, Chair Bullock. Thank you, Chair Bizzaro, for hosting this. Just to give the panel here an indication of, do you want me to switch? An indication, there you go, of the effectiveness of the program. Can you talk a little bit about the partners with Mercier Civic Institute, and then the recidivism rate, and how the recidivism rate for the folks who went through the program decreased significantly versus folks who did not?
Absolutely. Mercier Civic Institute, our partners, one of our partners, which is Amy Iser, she is the data-driven individual who makes sure everything we do follows a particular formula. And because of that approach, we kind of remove the feel-good things, right? And so, again, evidence-based, data-driven. And so because of her research and her data, from religiosity to taking the worship campaign, all these different technicals that, move the needle forward to address violence, Amy has been the one to spearhead those initiatives and that data, and she represented Mercy Point. At one point, I was a case manager for the reentry program, which is called Erie County Reentry Services Support Alliance. And so we've definitely witnessed a drastic decrease in numbers for recidivism. It's been years since I worked in that program, but I believe at one point we were close to like 27% reduction in recidivism for this Unified Reentry program. Again, that's that reentry prong to Unified Reentry. And so, again, it's data-driven, it's not feel-good, it's research. We follow a formula and a model that's been successful here for STEM.
And our last question for you, Mr. Outlaw, comes from Representative Snyder.
Thank you for testimony, and I find what you do so rewarding. You talked about bringing kids into the program. So how do you get the kids into the program? I guess my question is, is Unified Erie something that a magistrate or judge would say to a young person who's in trouble, you're going to go through this program?
So the way the kids get to the program, again, is based on their actions. If they identify to be a part of a gang, if they're participating in gun violence within the community, those create incident numbers within the police department. And based on those numbers, we then begin to identify what those individuals are. And we work in conjunction with juvenile probation, adult probation, state parole, to make sure that those partners who have those kids or those individuals, that we get them the information and we call them in. Now, once they're in our system, it is up to us to then, point them in the direction of the services and resources that they need to become a law-abiding citizen. But I will say this, that our judicial system here locally are strong supporters and advocates for the Unified Erie program. They understand the value, they witness the value of the program. The district attorney, Beth Hers, she is critical to Unified Erie's program. And one of the things that we kind of take pride in is that when we see these young gentlemen, these young men, more particularly persons of color, who change their ways, right? Who get the message. We recently had a call in last week, and one of the individuals was called in. He was participating in a program this past Saturday with law enforcement, right? 3-on-3 basketball. But again, so we've seen the effectiveness of this program. And so once again, once these kids become a part of our program, the case managers have to then identify what resources and networks we should plug them into so that we become successful.
Well, that's a good job, well done, because so many times young people just don't understand what is available to them. And if they're not getting it home, and I've always been the kind of parent and grandparent, I believe in putting the fear of God in a kid and letting them see this is where you're going to end up. Okay. So, good job, good job.
I'm scared of Rep. Snyder. I wouldn't want to be her child. We do have one more question for you, Mr. Outlaw, from Representative Miller.
Thank you. Yeah, just real quick with it. I know you talked about how it has to be that the kids have an action. That's how they get to you. All too often, I think that unfortunately, help comes after, right? So help comes after, right? And I know it's a question that we have in Allegheny County all too often. Mom or dad can't get access to A, B, and C, but only if your child's on probation, then you can get A, B, or C, right? Or something like that. Your child commits some action, then you get it. So I'm just wondering, in relation to your program that you're talking about here today, one, does it have a component of availability pre-action, right? Pre-action. Or should it, and what would you need to be able to have that program?
So Unified Erie, we are, one of our statements is that one prong doesn't fix the entire problem within our community. And so that's why we rely on our community partners to stand with us. And so if there's a program that let's say there's a program that exists at the Brooks T. Washington Center that, not even addresses, but it's an after-school program that teaches kids certain skill sets, etc. So we welcome those partnerships to come to the table with Unified Erie to that prevention prong and say, listen, here's our program. We believe this will yield this results. And so we welcome those partnerships. So there is definitely an opportunity for partners in the community to stand alongside Unified Erie and help us address this issue of violence.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Outlaw. And our last panelist for today is Reverend Darrell Cook, the pastor to Christ Community Church and chaplain to Erie Black Caucus.
First of all, let me say good morning to everyone. I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to speak, and of course, I'm filling in for my friend and my brother, Pastor Higginbottom, and I will speak a little bit to the impact that clergy feel as we relate to this issue of violence. but also want to speak to some areas that I think we have some opportunity for investment. First off, when we think about what's happening, Bishop Brock spoke to it, that many pastors are in a very difficult place. In the Black community, the pastor has always been one of the first go-tos. He's been the first, or she has been the first responder. So we're not just a spiritual leader oftentimes, we are considered the counselor. We are considered sometimes to have some medical credentials that we don't have. We are considered to be therapists. It's just so much that goes into it. And so, for instance, Pastor Higginbottom, he has preached more than 20, 30, 40 homegoing services throughout the COVID pandemic, and he's had several of them connected to youth violence here in the city of Erie. And while we speak to trauma, how it impacts the community, there is a level of trauma that impacts our spiritual leaders. And so I do want to put that on the table because while I know you who are public leaders and servants, you can testify to the fact that you feel overwhelmed, you feel under-resourced, and it is true as well for so many religious leaders, so many pastors and so many preachers who feel those same type of pains, but also feel it on a different level. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has created challenges across the board, and it's been the same way for church. We know that COVID didn't just create problems, it exposed disparities and it exposed issues that were already there. Many churches who are talking about the impact of their attendance now connected to COVID, they really could testify that attendance has been on the decline period, and we've also seen we've not always had the same level of impact with youth ministry even before COVID, and so it has impacted how we've addressed issues pertaining to violence and things that our young people are facing. I want to put that on the table because I think we have an opportunity in the first place of investment that I want to put out is that our churches, especially in the Black community, we have one of the greatest landmass opportunities in our communities. We're literally at the place now we can reimagine space in our churches. The Black church has always been the space in which education has been birthed out of, our HBCUs, many times in which there was response to Jim Crow or what have you. Those meetings occurred in the Black church. Religious leaders have always pushed public policy and pushed politicians from Frederick Douglass to MLK. We have seen this give and take. We have seen this tension. We've seen this push and pull, and I think we have an opportunity for investment in space as we think about not just what the church is going to look like post-pandemic, but what our communities are going to look like. And that brings me to my second opportunity for investment, and that is in 2021, we saw the need to impact our community in a different way, and so we launched our Community Development Corporation. It's called Empowered Life, where I serve and I, of course, pastor the church, and I also direct that organization. One way in which we saw we were going to impact young people is by bridging the digital divide. And many people, when they think about that, they think about broadband and having access to high-speed internet, but there is another side to it. When we think about media, and I want to put this on the table because we've been talking about violence, but we haven't been talking about the impact that media has on violence, digital media. For instance, there is a sub-genre of hip-hop called drill music. In drill music, we're seeing that many of the beefs between some of the rappers that are pouring out in Philadelphia, where I also serve, Chicago, New York City, many of those arguments are happening over music. So these young people are going into the studios and they're creating, quote, diss tracks, and they are going back and forth. It leaves the music and it ends up playing itself out on the street. Not just in the music, but we also see that in social media. of the studies that really helped us to drill down what we wanted to do is that we saw that many young people in our community are consumers of digital media more than they are creators of it. And so because of that, they pick up cues from other people. So they learn how to have arguments on social media. They learn how to have arguments through music from those who have come before them. And that's a learned behavior because they're consumers of it. And so one of the things that we try to do, and I've heard his name mentioned, and I want to give him a public shout out, my friend, my brother, a mentor of mine, Brother Gary Horton, who is, of course, the president of the NAACP. He runs his own programming as well here in the city of Erie. And he has brought us together, and he has created space for multiple nonprofits to receive funding. And one of the areas in which we received our funding through his work and things that he's advocated for is to present that programming. And we've been working with about 25 to 50 young people, and we've seen that they only knew how to watch YouTube videos, and now we're teaching them how to create content. And when we give them strategies for writing storyboards and creative writing, we put a camera in their hand and show them how to record and the elements of recording. We put a keyboard in front of them. My brother Corey, who's behind the camera right now, he's ran a music program for years right here in the city of Erie called Life Through Music. He was featured on Good Morning America. He's worked throughout this city. He can testify that one of the reasons why we do what we do is because somebody put some instruments in our hands when we were younger. And so I think that investing in digital media, teaching young folk how to become creators and not merely consumers of it, giving them positive interactions with Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, creating positive interactions, I think is going to go a long way. And it helps us to have a different conversation around the issue and to have preventative measures and not always reacting to what's going on.
Thank you, Pastor Cook. I think your comments, for me, put together what I believe I observed during the pandemic, which is how you started, is that communities, and particularly young people, lost their connections to organizations and resources, safe havens, whether it be an after-school program, counseling, group therapy, whatever it may be. Those resources were not available to them during the pandemic. And so a lot of those young people and their families that were in distress lost their safety net, lost their community connections, whether that be the church or elsewhere. And that was replaced with social media in many places, virtual interactions and other digital media. How can we connect communities, and particularly families that are in distress, with the resources that they need? And do you think that the disconnection during the pandemic fueled some of the violence that we are seeing today?
Yeah, I think so. In many ways, but I like some of the language that you're using. Safe spaces are so important, and what we saw throughout COVID is that for many of our kids, their homes are not safe spaces, and so they rely on schools and they rely on after-school programming. They rely on church. Not just for a safe space by way of protection, but also just food, things that we typically take for granted. I know several young people who had to, at an early age, 8 years old, and trying to take care of their siblings who are 3 and 4, and having to cook for the family. There's a lot that goes into being young in many of our communities, and it's not just black and brown, poor, white. It's just really across the board. We have some issues that we need to address, but I think safe spaces are important. We have to invest in them. Part of what I said about clergy earlier is important as well, and where I think we can make some investment is that we have to bring community partners together, because some stuff that I'm asked to do, I'm not qualified to do. I'm not trained to do. I need some partners. I need some folk to actually join with us, and we need resources in order to make that happen.
Thank you, Pastor Cook. We have 2 questions. We'll start with Leader McClinton, followed by our Whip Harris.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Reverend Cook, for being here with us today. I'm so glad to hear that you launched Empowered throughout the pandemic and to know about all the outreach you've been doing to children. Some of my colleagues probably wouldn't know this, but I'm a retired youth leader at my church. Spent 13 years working with children and their parents and pulling them out of the homes to come to our programs, picking them up. It was a joy. And before doing that leadership role, spent every summer with my mom doing outreach every summer, singing at her helm, bringing kids to camp, giving them opportunities to just be in a safe space to do basic things like getting a healthy meal. So when I see the changes in the generations, I was just whispering to Rep. Curry that her daughter is in a generation where there's a real disconnection, regardless of your faith, with even believing whether or not there should be faith. And I see a lot of anger and a lot of rage in our children. I mean, young ones. I'm not talking, 20s, young adults. I'm talking about younger children. And when I interact with them in my district, visiting them in schools, they say, well, Miss, you don't understand. You're not 15, you're not 12. You don't understand what it's like when someone is on the internet talking about you, how you looked on Zoom in Zoom school. Like they're trying to explain to me, what's the catalyst to all these issues. And to Brother Outlaw's point about trauma being transferred, how do we get our children to a point of healing where their rage, which usually is what drives the violence. People ask me, well, what's driving the violence? A lot of times it's simply anger and no way to release it and no way to be able to deal with it and get the healing that's needed. What has your experience been in that regard, whether it's connecting them to digital devices or to instruments so that they can find peace inside of themselves?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think one is some of the language I was just using, creating safe spaces, but then also really seeing devices and whatnot as vehicles to develop relationships. Because these kids really want relationship, and many of their relationships are toxic for whatever the reason. They're angry because of something that has happened. There's some dysfunction, there's some trauma that needs to be addressed. They don't trust, not just religious authority, they don't trust at times at school. And so I think it's may sound cliche-ish, but relationship building is just so important. And really investing in their lives and letting them know that they are seen, I think is very important. And that means, and I'm not just talking about as reps, I'm talking about clergy as well, they can't just be photo ops, or they can't just be people that we go to in times of crisis. We have to create opportunities. To open up our offices. This is what governance looks like. This is what policy making looks like. So I think creating those opportunities for positive interactions, whether it's law enforcement, policymakers, clergy, I think we need to be intentional about developing relationships, and stuff like I was talking about becomes tools to make that happen.
Thank you, Reverend, for being here. We appreciate you and your comments. I grew up in the church every Sunday, Wednesday night Bible study, Friday night service, Saturday choir rehearsal. Don't ask me to sing
Oh, we plays too, okay.
I grew up playing the piano in my church, I did. I say that because I'm often reminded of the scripture in Proverbs that teaches us to train up a child, right? The way that they should go. When they get old, they won't depart from it.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes we mistake. It didn't say that they wouldn't depart. It said when they get old, they wouldn't depart, right? Because even if you look at the prodigal son did depart, but came back, right? And I think sometimes, and I bring that up because whether you're a Christian, Muslim, Jewish, I personally believe that my upbringing in church gave me a foundation, right? And even if people aren't, the most religious, right, in their older age, it still created some type of foundation for you, right? And I wonder, my first question is, I wonder how we can resurrect that part. And this is not me proselytizing for my church and state friends, but for me, there is a foundation that you get from going to some type of household of faith. And I believe when we look at the gun violence in our communities, a lot of it is because a lot of our young people just don't have a solid foundation, right? So how do we utilize our churches in that sense to create the foundation for young people is my first question. My second question is, you said something that was very intriguing to me about the digital space, because I do believe that we need to change the methods by which we communicate to young people. I agree with our leader. There are lots of beefs that happen because somebody says something about somebody on Instagram, right? Our young people are consuming hours of TikTok. Like, I look at my screen time sometime, like, yo, I was on TikTok for an hour today? Like, this is crazy. And I'm busy. So a young person sitting at home, like, they're literally on TikTok for hours. So how do we use that? Because, back in the day, your mom would say, get off of the video game and get into the books. But the truth is, there are young people who are becoming millionaires from the video games. There are young people who are using social media from an entrepreneurial spirit, and they're becoming very successful in creating their own streams of income from social media influencing. So my two questions is, one, how do we use the church, the mosque, the synagogue to recreate foundations for our young people? But then the second part is, how do we use the digital piece to kind of wrap them in involvement, but also show them how to use it as another stream of income?
Yeah, I mean, two good questions. I think for the first part of your question, Mike Outlaw, who was just up, he referenced a study that talked about religiosity and the impact of just 45 minutes to an hour of faith a week, how much that impacts young people and people, period. And so there was a campaign right here in the city of Erie that was really about that, giving them that 1 hour. I think part of my conversation around investment is important, how we reimagine space and create opportunities to bring in funding, because at this point, no matter how many people think that every church has Creflo Dollar money, the truth of the matter is most churches are under 100 people. And most churches don't have budgets that can barely pay the pastor and musician, let alone a youth worker. And so when we talk about investment, creating opportunity with our spaces to bring in some sort of youth worker that can engage young people, I think that needs to be something that's staffed. And I think that we can work together to make that happen, because I think it's mutually beneficial. Because even though there is some angst about church, some issues people have with church, church is still a trusted place in our community. And the reason why I know it is because when something happens, my phone is blowing up. Pastor Higginbottom's phone is blowing up. Bishop Brock's phone. People who I've never seen in church walk up in the street, you my pastor, because they saw me on Facebook. And so I know people are engaged and tuned in. I just think we need to create some sort of opportunity to have some dollars, to have some coordinators to help us to make those connections. Whether it's we have it on our side, or you have some connectors on your side that we can make some point of connection with that. I think that there's some opportunity there. Number two, I think your point is spot on, that telling kids to put down social media just isn't going to happen. It's here to stay. And so we have to figure out how we can be better stewards of it. For instance, right in Philadelphia, you got Gillian Wallow right now that's just killing the game with $1 million worth of game. That podcast is just doing work. So I think we can find money and resources to get a Gillian Wallow in the room with some kids who need to understand this is how podcasting works. This is how advertisement for podcasting works. This is what Facebook ads look like. This is what YouTube ads look like. Because many times, most folk who got into the drug game didn't get into it because they wanted to be shooting at each other and killing each other. Many times they wanted to create some income for themselves. And if we can show that there's some opportunities in social media, you can monetize it. It's not even always through advertising. You can monetize through your own merchandise. You can monetize by developing some high value skill. If we have conversations around that, I think that we can really go a long way with impacting young folk, not taking social media away, because that's just a useless conversation. But how can we steward it better, I think becomes the question we need to ask.
Thank you. And I believe we have 2 more questions, one from Representative Williams, followed by Representative Kincaid.
Good afternoon, and thank you just for your comments. I've enjoyed everything I've heard. Admittedly, I wanted to say amen, but, and we are in church. So. Let me just echo the sentiments I think that you raised in terms of reimagining the contribution that the church provides by way of space. Because when you consider the valuation of a marriage that's saved, a young person who's transitioned from addictions, etc., I think there's a way in which the sacred spaces of churches have not been appreciated as small business incubators and seen only as houses of faith formation. So I think when you talk about reimagining how we utilize that space, I think that's a message that needs to be heard in a lot of different places, particularly in the General Assembly and in the communities who don't understand that churches don't take from communities, they add. Additionally, though, I wanted to just raise this issue of the challenges that I think my colleague has articulated, in that the difficulty right now is not only ministering to the unchurched, it's reaching those formerly hurt by church. And so that has created another tension post-pandemic that I think attracting young people and others has created for all of us. So my question is there any thought to reimagining even how we do church? Thinking contextually now, the church has historically been a place that is a come-to structure, and that served us well. Should we now be rethinking contextually how to make the church not a come-to structure, but a go-to? In other words, there are spaces and places where young people are, and many of them will never come to church. So perhaps we need to rethink now how the church becomes a go structure rather than a come-to. And I'd just be interested in your comments regarding that.
Yeah, I'm right with you, and I don't want to get too theological here, but the truth of the matter is, I think the truth of the matter is what you're touching on is what Jesus called us to do anyway. So what his commission was is to go ye. That's the command there, and I think that the idea is, as we are going, we ought to be developing relationships. We ought to be impacting people, and a part of that is we can no longer just merely count footprints. We got to count fingerprints, and so TikTok has become a part of our strategy. So many. I came up in the Baptist context, so I can be long-winded at times. As of now, short form content is out there, so YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels. We have to figure out how to convey messaging in 60 seconds or less, and we can't be afraid to identify methods that are working without compromising the message that we have. And so we definitely need to, as a church, do a better job of going out, but not just to young people, but even to some in our community that are already doing good work. There are entrepreneurs that are already doing good work. There are people who have dreams about getting into policy making, that the church can be a bridge, a point of connection for them, because we do have relationships that sometimes we take for granted. And so I certainly agree. I think for many churches, COVID-19 has forced us to have the type of conversation that you're talking about. Many of us are having it. Unfortunately, some who are not won't be here much longer, or they're going to have to merge with somebody who is having that conversation. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I guess I want to sort of take that question in the opposite direction, which is, I think there are a lot of people who are more and more not engaged with the church, and don't necessarily see it as a way to, get involved. And I think, to Representative Williams' point, there are people that have been hurt by the church. There are people who have been hurt by people who claim to be religious, and it has really soured them on formal religion. But I do think, today has really highlighted it as well, that there is absolutely a place when it comes to violence prevention and reduction for the church. And I wonder if you can talk about how the church could be involved in more, I guess, secular activities to, ensure that there's support in those communities as well, to let people know that, there are different resources, and you don't have to necessarily be religious or, have gotten to a place in your religious journey to access the resources of a church or a synagogue or a mosque.
Yeah, so good. And I think a good place to start is what we're doing right now. That that church has had space, that we can create opportunities for this. I do want to say that really has always been the context for the Black church. The Black church has always been a place not just for preaching and theology, but for social engagement, and that's really from its very beginning. I mean, right there in Philadelphia, you've got Richard Allen, and you've got great history right there, where it's always been about, for the most part, public engagement. I think that we can utilize our space for that, but we also can create better partnerships with you all, and that you all don't just come to where we are, we come to where you are. I do need to say this, because the church takes a lot of hits. There are several churches that are doing good work, and not just inside of the walls. And so all you gotta do is look on social media. There's several churches that buy up gas stations, and they're giving away gas. I know our church has historically done, food pantry stuff. We've historically done giveaways, community engagement. I think we definitely continue those things, but we up the ante. I think that there's an opportunity, business incubators in our buildings. I think that's an opportunity. Education, partnerships with local colleges. I think there's a number of things that have been done that we can lean into even more, that isn't always religious, but it uses the resources and the connections the church already has, whether that's in our buildings or someplace else.
I think that's great, because I think there are a lot of people who would absolutely engage, but are a little hesitant because they're like, well, I'm not really religious, and that's not a place that I'm welcome. And I think making sure that people know that they're welcome wherever they are in their journey. The other thing I wanted to highlight is, I guess I'll take a little almost victory lap with the north side of Pittsburgh. We actually have the Andy Warhol Museum just started what they're calling the Pop District. And it is a program intended to reach out to diverse kids, vulnerable kids, and teach them exactly what you and Whip Harris were talking about, which is how to, learn social media and make it something that you can turn into a career, a way to make money and understand it in a healthier way. So I would absolutely encourage my colleagues to, that if that's sort of a next step, that, the Pop District may be another place that we should talk to about their programming. So thank you.
Right. And just a quick pitch, part of our programming is that as we train kids to be social media managers, that we want to partner with local businesses as well as policymakers so that they can, for a season, manage maybe media for them, maybe take pictures. And so I'll open that up because we don't mind traveling to Philadelphia. We don't mind making a connection, snapping some pictures, and maybe for a day managing social media for a few of you. So yeah, just want to throw that out there. I don't know if there's any more questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Pastor Cook. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us today for this policy hearing. Again, I'd like to thank Bishop Brock and the Eagle Nest Church family and community, Selena King and Erie Black Caucus, my leaders with me, the chair of the policy committee, Ryan Bizzaro, our whip, Jordan Harris, and our leader, Joanna McClinton, and all of the members of the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus, as well as all of the members of the House Democratic Caucus for joining us for today's policy hearing. And for everyone in the audience, this issue is very important to us, and trust that we will be bringing this information back to the Capitol to work on legislation and policy and investments in the kind of programs and legislation that we believe can really impact our communities. So thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you.